Newswatch magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
Ever since the advent of international communism, the number one target has been the United States of America. They were actually founded by the Illuminati in order to be the seen enemy of the United States of America, which was the greatest nation on the face of the earth. A man by the name of W. Cleon Skousen wrote a book called The Naked Communist. Within the pages of this particular book, he actually outlined 45 points, and he placed these in the Congressional Record of the United States, by which international communism wanted to actually implement inside the borders of this country so they could literally destroy the United States from within. Now notice what was placed, and I'm going to only pinpoint today in this message one of those 45 points which the communists wanted to achieve within the United States of America. Notice that one objective that I want to discuss today is they wanted to capture one or both of the political parties of the United States of America, and my objective in this message is to show that the last three presidents have done exactly that. Many people who have followed this movement of international communism do not realize that communism and socialism is the same movement. They simply believe that international socialism is the step just before they arrive at pure communism. So what I'd like to do now, in order for you and I to understand that socialism and communism are bedfellows, they're all a part of the same movement, there's no difference in them whatsoever, is I want to give two quotes from individuals, one of them claiming to be a socialist and ran 6 times on the Socialist Party ticket in the United States for the presidency. Then I want to give a quote from a communist that everybody in the world has heard of who has kept up with the international communist movement. Let's break away now and go to those quotes. Mr. Norman Thomas ran 6 times for the candidacy for the President of the United States on the socialist ticket. He said in the past, and notice what he said, it's very important for the American people. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name liberalism, and we've all heard it, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. Notice we've been doing this for the last 40 years until America will one day be a socialist nation, not knowing how it happened. Notice now that there was another individual who actually told what international socialism and communism was all about and how they were going to achieve dominance inside the United States of America. 3 months before his 1959 visit to the United States, Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the ruthless dictator of international communism, he said the following, and I quote, "We cannot expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find they have communism." End of quote. Has the United States been progressing towards socialism no matter which president or party, whether it's the Republican or Democrats, are in office? Absolutely yes. Notice this front cover title of a recent magazine called Republican Socialism. It literally describes how no matter what party is in office, they've been leading us down the same primrose path towards socialism. But we need proof that either party, whether they're Republican or Democrat, is leading us to the same conclusion: international socialism, the stepping stone to the final goal to be achieved of international communism. Let's just briefly explore the background of the last 3 presidents to see if they have knowingly or unknowingly led this nation further into the arms of international socialism, preparing for the day when international communism will rule supreme. First, let's take a look at Mr. Ronald Reagan, because he was the one who claimed to be the most conservative president in the last 60 years. Let's review, first of all, a speech made by Mr. Ronald Reagan. Then let's actually see what he has done in politics. Then you can decide for yourself whether he meant what he said in that speech, or whether he followed Mr. Roger Baldwin, who was the founder of the Communist Front organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, when Mr. Baldwin said, and I quote, "We must wave flags and appear to be patriotic, but destroy the system as fast as we can," end of quote. In other words, say one thing to the public to gain votes, but do the exact opposite when you get into office. Now let's cut away to Mr. Reagan's speech.
Well over 200 years have passed since the gallant men that formed our nation met in a carpenter's hall in Philadelphia. They were men of many backgrounds, but all with one common denominator: their faith in God. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Those first Americans proclaimed their freedom because they believed God had granted freedom to all men. For decades, America remained true to her beliefs, thanking God in peacetime and turning to Him in moments of crisis. During the Civil War, perhaps our nation's darkest hour, Abraham Lincoln said, "I would be the most foolish person on this footstool earth if I believed for one moment that I could perform the duties assigned to me without the help of one who is wiser than all." I don't believe any man or woman can serve in this office without understanding exactly what Mr. Lincoln meant. But in recent years, years not too distant in our past, America did seem to be losing her religious and moral bearings. Our social standards seemed to be dissolving. Our economic and governmental institutions were in disarray. Our defenses had grown weak. All over the world, America was becoming known not for strength and resolve, but for vacillation and self-doubt. It seemed for a season as though our nation was in permanent decline, and that any sense of justice, self-discipline, and duty was ebbing out of public life. But the God who has so richly blessed our land also gave us free will, the power to choose our own destiny. And that is what the American people are doing. After putting a stop to that long decline, we are today seeking a rebirth of freedom and faith, a great national renewal. And we've only just begun. Together, we can show the world that America is and will always remain one nation under God.
Now let's notice some of the background of Mr. Reagan. By 1945, Ronald Reagan had become president of the Left-Wing Screen Actors Guild. Left-wing means communist. During his tenure, he was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee in connection with the communist writers and actors within that particular union. According to Lou Cannon's book, which he wrote in the 70s called Reagan, he insisted the communists formed a political party, and he would hesitate to see any political party outlawed on the basis of political ideology. In taking this particular position, Mr. Ronald Reagan was simply parroting the typical communist line of that day. Mr. Ronald Reagan became a charter member of the Fabian Socialist Control Americans for Democratic Action in 1950. That was found in the book, Here's the Rest of Him, by Stefkin, put out in 1970. In 1958, Mr. Ronald Reagan became an active member of a Communist Front organization. It was called the National Advisory Committee of the American Veterans. This was found in the California Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, recorded in 1947 to 1952. He also joined and actively supported the Communist Front organizations called the Hollywood branch of the American Veterans Committee and also the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions. Mr. Ronald Reagan played an upfront role in an organization called the California League for a Democratic Far Eastern Policy. This league was very closely linked to and followed the lead of the communist-dominated Institute of Pacific Relations in their particular drive to overthrow China for communism and install the butcher Mao Zedong in control of that great country. The Senate committee, chaired by a Senator Pat McCarran, investigated the Institute for Pacific Relations and reported, and I quote, "The Institute of Pacific Relations is an instrument of communist policy, propaganda, and military intelligence," end of quote. The FBI raided the offices of the Institute of Pacific Relations, their magazine called Amerasia. They found 1,800 sensitive stolen documents of the United States government. These communists, working with George Marshall, Joseph Stilwell, and President Truman at that time, were instrumental in bringing murderous Mao Zedong to power in China by conspiring against our anti-communist friend and ally, Chiang Kai-shek. Without a communist China and the Red Butcher Mao to run it, there would never have been a Korean War. There would have never been an invasion of North Vietnam into South Vietnam, which only benefited international communism and the international bankers that sponsored it. Notice now Mr. Ronald Reagan, working with Marxist Alan Cranston from California, was a leader in the infamous un-American and communist-dominated United World Federalist. The United World Federalists are working for a one-world government, just like international communism, socialism, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. All of these very highly questionable and subversive affiliations occurred during Ronald Reagan's middle age, and he can scarcely use the excuse that he was a youth and that he is not responsible for his one-world socialist activities. All his activities are probably best described by Reagan himself in his campaign book when he ran for governor, then for president of the United States, entitled, "Where's the Rest of Me?" He described himself in that particular publication as a near hopeless liberal. What he neglected to tell the American public when they started to vote was that this was not just a phase that he was going through, but he would never recover from his desire for a one-world socialist government. In 1954, Mr. Ronald Reagan was hired by General Electric Corporation and later became one of the best public relations men that they had. The longtime president of General Electric, a man by the name of Gerard Swoop, authored Franklin Delano Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration Plan, which became the blueprint for corporate socialism in America. That documentation was found in Wall Street and FDR by Anthony Sutton, a 1975 publication. On October 22, 1964, Mr. Ronald Reagan gave a speech called Rendezvous with Destiny. This so enthralled conservatives that they decided, many of them, to support him and finance him for governor for the state of California in 1966. Mr. Reagan campaigned as an arch conservative on the basis of a premise to, and I quote, squeeze, cut, and trim the size of state government by at least 10%. He sounded like a bargain, but we're going to see if all of this actually took place. Now, it doesn't take a political cynic to conclude early, if you want to identify a politician's real character, you quit listening to what he says, then you turn around and examine what he actually does and he signs into law. Notice what he did in raising taxes. His sales tax increase was 248%, personal income tax 404%, corporate tax 160%, property tax 96%, and gasoline tax 40%. When Mr. Reagan was running for the President of the United States, he said that he would not raise taxes. He said that he wanted to balance the American budget. And yet, for the years of 1981 through 1988 that he was President of the United States, he created more national debt than all presidents combined, starting with George Washington all the way up through his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. So here we can see that every single person who is a socialist believes in the explosion of debt with liberal projects that put the country into further debt. The reason for this is because they know that if they destroy the economic base of a nation, they'll destroy the nation and it'll fall to international socialism and communism, of which Mr. Reagan was either a knowing or unknowing tool. Mr. Ronald Reagan kept bragging about how he got an army of individuals off welfare and onto what he called workfare in the state of California. And yet there were over 2,270,000 on welfare, and he ended up only getting about 9,267 that were ever placed on workfare. And on top of that, he denied welfare to another 886 that was never on it to begin with. And while he was governor of the state of California, welfare skyrocketed and went up 43% in the period of time he was governor. Now, what happened to other socialistic programs? Going to the very records that were compiled by the United Republicans of California, who as early as 1975 issued a resolution outlining what a dangerous man Reagan was, opposed him as a candidate for president, and warned Americans to carefully scrutinize his record before voting. In their 4-page report, they've documented the sordid record of this self-acclaimed conservative. I want to quote just briefly part of that report. Quote, he liberalized the educational program by appointing liberal Dr. John Ford and others to the State Department of Education. They increased the tempo of progressive socialism while adopting guidelines providing for a non-religious, humanistic school program, eliminating moral values in favor of social change legislation. End of quote. And that was taken from the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, January 15th, 1974, and was made a part of this United Republicans of California's outline of the history of Ronald Reagan. One of the very first bills that he signed as governor was the infamous Sex Education Bill. He also signed Bill AB 2265 in 1972, giving the state regulation and control of private schools. Contrary to federal law, he signed Bill AB 724, ordering the state education department to racially balance and integrate all grades within schools and in all school districts, and enforce this order by forced busing or any other means necessary. Governor Reagan also set up the notorious planning, programming, and budgetary system for California in order to facilitate the unconstitutional and socialist federal funding and control of the state's public schools. What about Mr. Reagan and abortion? In 1967, his very first year in office, Ronald Reagan signed the Belason Abortion Act, which legalized abortion upon demand and to be paid for by Medi-Cal, that is, by all taxpayers of the state of California. By the end of his second term, this biological holocaust totaled 500,000 legalized murders of unwanted babies. This may shed some light on why, as President of the United States, he appointed left-winger, which means socialist communist, Sandra O'Connor to the Supreme Court of the United States. She had promoted abortion upon demand in Arizona for many, many years. What about socialized medicine? It was given a tremendous boost in California when Ronald Reagan signed a total of 11 bills expanding its scope and its cost. When Reagan took office, Medi-Cal had a budget of $252 million. When he left office in 1974, Medi-Cal was spending $1,165 million, an increase of 784% from the time he took office. What about crime control in the state of California? There were more than twice as many major crimes in California when Ronald Reagan left office as there were each year before he was elected as governor. During his tenure as governor of California, he ordered prisons to be emptied and closed down. The largest number of prisoners on parole were preying on citizens of all communities. They attacked them. Murderers were turned loose, drug addicts to go back into society. Ronald Reagan subsidized county governments whose courts did not incarcerate criminals, convicted but immediately freed them on parole. So here is the opportunity in order to truly punish criminals, and yet he turned them loose immediately and paid the local communities to do so. The result was in Los Angeles, California, that 90% of the convicted felons immediately went back into the streets to start their crime wave all over again. He centralized law enforcement and the justice system, cutting out local control and making it state and federal control. He enthusiastically adopted the subversive program of the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, placing hardened criminals on 72-hour leave, and pursued their policy of early parole, all of which increased major crimes in the state of California, and especially in the city of Los Angeles, under this massive liberalization program. Ronald Reagan was supposedly opposed to gun control laws. At least that's what he stated when he was going around speaking before the public, trying to get elected as governor. While he always favored and supported Nixon's unconstitutional executive order, which saddled Americans with the oppressive regionalization of this country, he preferred to disguise his support by calling it the New Federalism. As soon as he had the authority to do so, Mr. Ronald Reagan actively promoted what is called regionalism. So what is regionalism? This is simply a conspiracy for scrapping our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and destroying the sovereignty of our country, the states' rights, and the nation, so the socialists can impose a one-world socialist government upon us. This idea was nurtured in the Rockefellers' University of Chicago, which has been called the citadel of Fabian socialism in America. Professor Charles E. Merriam was in charge of this program at its headquarters at 1313 East 60th Street in Chicago, Illinois. The whole web of subversion came out to be known to the public as Metro 1313. Do you believe that the United States of America has been placed into 10 regions preparing us for the time when the new world order will take over and the United States will be divided up? Let's cut away to a film strip now that was taken by me personally. Notice this FEMA facility, which is in Denton, Texas, 800 North Loop 288. It shows graphically that there are 6 or 5 states that is a part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency of Region number 6. There are 10 such regions in the United States. New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana are a part of this particular FEMA agency. And it looks more like a military installation because it's going to be that agency that will take over and run the government when the emergency is declared. This particular movement, FEMA, is to be a silent socialist revolution promoted by gradualism. They're very patient people. That would eliminate county government, state boundaries, county boundaries, and it would do away with elected representatives. It would eliminate local, state, or national control. It would limit our right to work, travel, or live where we chose, with no more Army, Navy, or Air Force, no freedom of speech or religion. This transfer of powers from cities, states, and counties to a centralized federal level and then to a totalitarian world government will be accomplished by transferring power from elected officials to the unelected bureaucrats. Do you ever wonder why we elect mayors, county commissioners, and state governors, and they put on the public payroll city managers, county managers, and the president appoints regional chairmen, all of whose function is to govern the governors, state legislators, county supervisors, mayors, and councilmen? Because for 5 decades, Americans have been brainwashed by the humanists in our schools and media to accept full socialism. They seem right for the imposition of regionalism when the time came. On February 10th, 1972, President Nixon, in flagrant disregard for his oath of office and Article 10 of the Constitution, inserted Executive Order number 11,647 in the Federal Registry, eliminating state and county boundaries, thus reducing the 50 states to 10 federal regions. 11 days later, President Richard Nixon assigned 10 regional chairmen of FEMA, answerable only to the President of the United States, to carry out the federal edicts to all regularly elected officials in their federal region. These 10 men are a sign, not elected, not answerable or responsible to the citizens that they control, and they cannot be removed from office by the people. We're actually operating under two governments at the present time. Number one, what is left of our constitutional elected government, which is rapidly losing power. And number two, the unelected regional world government that only takes and carries out orders from the communist-controlled United Nations and Metro 1313 Syndicate. On propositions that Ronald Reagan submitted for vote of the people, Reagan approved changes in the wording of the State of California Constitution designed, I quote, to transfer the inherent power of the people, end of quote, to the, and I quote again, inherent power of the legislature, end of quote. Meaning, of course, the unelected bureaucrats. So they were just taking power away from the people and giving it to the unelected bureaucrats. This was done with no explanation to the voters of the real loss of freedom and control that they were giving up. Reagan also advocated a change in the state constitution, giving a non-governing or non-government body the power to tax. This information was found in the Los Angeles Times, January 3rd, 1967. In 1971, Ronald Reagan signed Bill AB 1301, making it mandatory for Californians to obtain state or regional approval before they could sell any of their land, no matter how small a parcel it was. He further decreased property rights through a series of land use bills and redevelopment laws. He urged state authority over coastal property. He supported creation of the Lake Tahoe regional government, allocating some California land to Nevada in line with federal guidelines. Governor Reagan also called for streamlining local governments by merging cities and counties in California. This required the elimination of numerous county governments, which Reagan called, I quote, a horse and buggy system of local government, end of quote. That was also found in the Los Angeles Times. What about gun control and Governor Reagan? While campaigning for governor and then later President of the United States, Reagan promised to assist any effort that would take from the American citizen his right to own and carry firearms. However, in 1968, Governor Reagan signed into California law the Mulford Act, which was the most sweeping and progressive or repressive gun control legislation passed in the United States up until that date. This bill nullified any citizen's right to defend himself and banned loaded guns from any public street or highway in California unless the owner could prove that he was in some kind of imminent danger of attack. That was found in the book Here's the Rest of Him, page 60 and 61. However, Ronald Reagan, not satisfied with the stifling of Californians' constitutional rights, Article 2 that is, Governor Reagan enthusiastically embraced the plan proposed by the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which would eventually provide for the confiscation of all guns. Governor Reagan agreed with the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration to make California a model pilot state for the whole country for the confiscation of your firearms. Under the guise of reform for criminal justice improvement, Reagan appointed and arranged for financing the State Office of Criminal Justice Planning. With a large staff, they were to be the task force to carry out the Law Enforcement Assistant Administration program of prohibiting the private possession of handguns. And what you need to understand is that any time the socialist communists are nearly ready for the takeover of a country, the last program they start popularizing is the confiscation of all guns, so there'll be no one to stand up against them when they take over that country. All of the information that I've given you so far is a part of Governor Reagan and President Reagan's history in placing bills into law. And you can't come to but one conclusion. That conclusion was that Ronald Reagan is not, was not, never has been, and never will be a political conservative. He actively supports world socialism and world government. His becoming president, after he became president, he actually called for free trade and received it with Canada, and then President Bush followed up. He pushed through the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations organization. I want to stop here and discuss that for just a moment. Every president of the United States had rejected the Genocide Convention Treaty, even though it had been brought forward. The Senate had not passed it into law ever since 1947 and 48, when it was adopted by the United Nations organization. And the reason why is all the lawyers that read it stated that it was definitely against individuals and not against, say, Nazi war crimes or Russian war crimes to eliminate whole populations for political reasons. But it was designed to be against individuals. And within the pages of the law itself, it states that you can be arrested for causing someone else mental harm. And Mr. Reagan, a professing Christian, stated, or he is the one who actually introduced this, starting his second term into the presidency. Only after a conference with David Rockefeller and members of the Council on Foreign Relations, then they sponsored him for the second term to be reelected. And the first thing he called for was the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations to be passed into law. So anyone, and in the United States today, laws are being passed in all 50 states. They're called hate crime laws. And they read practically word for word, just like the Genocide Convention Treaty to the United Nations. So if you and I are convicted on a local level of some genocide crime, it's simply a hate crime, calling somebody a racial slur. Or it's designed really to shut down anybody stating the things that I'm saying today, talking about the rise of world government and all of these organizations that's being used to promote world government. And then also they said that anyone who was in consistent agreement with someone who was accused of genocide, then they also could be punished just because you agreed with that person. So this was Mr. Ronald Reagan's background. So we can see that he was working right into the hands, either knowingly or unknowingly, with those who are working for world government. One of the most evil things that Mr. Ronald Reagan ever concocted was Rex 84. This was worked on in the East Wing of the White House by Colonel Oliver North, called Ollie North. Rex 84 is a plan by which they're refurbishing old military installations and the prison system around it. They're now building as many as 37 that are verified, and it's rumored up to 100 prison camps for what they called illegal aliens. However, these holding and detention centers for illegal aliens Anyone who understands the plan for world government knows that it's going to be a program by which the United States, when they declare martial law, or when the Federal Emergency Management Agency takes over and the United Nations military equipment starts rolling and occupying America for world government, American citizens who do not want to give up their freedom, patriots, Christians, and so on, are going to be rounded up in massive numbers and placed in these concentration camps. They're scattered all over the United States of America. And this was designed during the Ronald Reagan administration, his first term, by Colonel Oliver North in the East Wing of the White House. One of the largest holding facilities is in Alaska on Highway 3. They say it will hold up to 1 million individuals. There are other areas. One is out in the desert of Arizona that's been seen by former military personnel who were about to retire, and they went driving in the desert a week before their retirement was to take place, just having fun with their buddies, and they ran upon this installation where there were barbed wire turned in to keep people from breaking out, and it was just row after row after row of barracks, and yet not one single individual was there at the military installation. So yes, there is coming something awfully horrible for those in the United States of America, and the presidency of the United States has been used to foment this evil conspiracy. Mr. George W. Bush succeeded Ronald Reagan as the next president of the United States for the Republican Party. And the very first thing he did, and he ran as one of his mottos, was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." However, Senator Moynihan raised the lip of George Bush in this cartoon and saw underneath it that there were some things that you could not read that was found underneath his lips. Does George Bush know about the New World Order? According to Parade magazine of July 2nd, 1989, it quoted President Bush as saying that desire for freedom from tyranny inspired the world and still does. Look on the back of any dollar bill and you'll see it. The Great Seal of the United States bears the motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages. Notice on the back side of the $1 bill the word Annuit Coeptus. This literally means God has smiled upon our endeavor. And at the bottom of the pyramid, notice Novus Ordo Seclorum, and as George Bush stated, it means the new order of the ages, showing that he does know what is happening on the world scene and that he's actively helping to build a new world order.
Stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
President Bush spoke before the United Nations on October 1st, 1990, where he confirmed his support of world government by the year 2000 or shortly thereafter. I quote him, "We," meaning members of the United Nations, "must join together in a new compact, all of us, to bring the United Nations into the 21st century. The calendar offers up a convenient milestone, a signpost by which to measure our progress as a community of nations. The year 2000 marks a turning point, beginning the turn of the new millennium. The United Nations can bring about a new day to press forward to cap an historic movement toward a new world order." End of quote. And of course, we know the only movement in the 20th century has been toward international socialism and communism, of which Mr. George Bush, as we'll show, has been a part of all those movements. This left-hand side of the dollar bill, if you'll get one out and look at it, also contains a pyramid with an all-seeing eye above it. You will also notice that the capstone or cornerstone has been removed off the pyramid and that the all-seeing eye has replaced it. A woman by the name of Sharon Boyd, writing in the New Age magazine, What Is, proclaims, and I quote, "Ancient Freemasonry employed the triangle, usually in connection with the all-seeing eye, throughout the entire system of Masonry. No symbol is more important in its significance. It is the Masonic symbol of the grand architect of the universe. The entire symbol of the eye of providence, the all-seeing eye, and the radiant triangle forms a cornerstone of the unfinished pyramid." Information came from the book Occult America, the United States Founded on Occultism, Not Christianity, What Is, Volume 1 by Sharon Boyd. As President, George Bush has surrounded himself with fellow brothers of what is called the Skull and Bone. And now we'll show you a book that has been put out by Anthony Sutton called The Introduction to the Order. And this actually proves that he is interlinked with related groups such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and other groups like the Bilderbergers that are working for world government. On the very day that Mr. George Bush kicked off his presidency, Bush signaled his unchanging allegiance to the Brotherhood. At his inauguration ceremony, his oath of office was actually he was sworn in with his hand resting on the Masonic Bible that was furnished to him by his fellow Masons at St. John's Masonic Lodge, 71 West 23rd Street, New York City. It was the same Bible printed in London, England in 1767 that was used at the inauguration of Warren G. Harding, Dwight David Eisenhower, and Jimmy Carter. These three presidents were all Masons, as was George Bush. For his national security advisor and right-hand man, George Bush chose Brent Scowcroft, and Scowcroft as intelligence. He was an intelligence buff with international banking connections before he became the head of the National Security Advisory. He had also been president previously of Kissinger and Associations, and this was found in the U.S. News and World Report, October 7th, 1991, page 28-29. Now this is the world, this Kissinger and Associate, the world's most prestigious and influential lobbyist firm, ruled and headed by Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, who also his double agent KGB code name was Bohr during World War II. In turn, Kissinger's mentor or benefactor has long been billionaire David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller, indisputably one of the world's richest men, and as one of its chief power brokers, has the highest regard for the members of the Skull and Bone. Rockefeller Finance Services Incorporated, the main corporate entity in the Rockefeller family's expensive and extensive business empire, is personally managed by a bonesman, member of the Skull and Bones organization, the very aggressively brilliant J. Richardson Dilworth, who was a Skull and Bones class of 1938. In 1973, Rockefeller, with the help of disciples Zygmunt Brzezinski and Averell Harriman, both bonesmen of the Skull and Bones class of 1917, the same as Prescott S. Bush, George Bush's father, founded what is called the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission is a group with a goal of hastening the era of world government and promoting an international economy controlled behind the scenes by the secret brotherhood of which George Bush is a part, the Skull and Bone. Brzezinski was President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and intelligence coordinator, the same position held by Henry Kissinger in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and now by Brent Scowcroft when George Bush was as the President of the United States. George Bush has served in the past as a director of the Globalist Trilateral Commission, while both Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger have long been active members of the same group. Moreover, as we shall discover in our detailed explanation of the unusual and rapid rise to political stardom of George Bush, it was Richard Nixon who, as president, played a key role in catapulting the young bonesman to the top of the political heap. In other words, he helped him to get started in the oil business. In turn, Richard Nixon's chief mentor and backer, once again, was David Rockefeller. So in other words, David Rockefeller, billionaire, chairman of the multinational Chase Manhattan Bank, Council on Foreign Relations, czar, Bilderberger overseer, and founder of the Trilateral Commission, has, through his insiders in the Oval Office of the White House, successfully manipulated the foreign and economic policies of the United States for a quarter of a century or more. Events have proven that George Bush, though very wary of his public image and vulnerability to the electorate, and he gave up and did not even hardly campaign for the presidency against the Democratic Party in 1991, nevertheless has systematically carried out the blueprint and agenda of his benefactors in the secret brotherhood since his first days in public office as a young and aspiring U.S. congressman from Houston, Texas. George Bush has always been keenly aware that his power base depends on his standing in the polls, not just the polls and the electorate, but his power base depends on the degree to which he is able to please his superiors and his peers in the Skull and Bone fraternity and the even more powerful elite of the secret brotherhood, the group that oversees and directs the activities of all the secret societies. As Guy Molinaw recently noted in his political newsletter, The Commonwealth Report, this is Bush's only existential belief, that politics is based on the personal relationship of leaders, that doing politics means hammering things out with a handful of major figures. End of quote. This was found in the Los Angeles Weekly, January 4th through the 10th, 1991, page 13. That handful of major figures that George Bush talked about most certainly includes his bosses in the Brotherhood. My research and investigation in the Brotherhood reveals that George Bush, as president of the world's greatest military nation, the United States of America, is the ultimate insider. While the people of the United States and the other 226 countries of the world view the president as the central figure in world affairs, the real truth is that George Bush is only one of its directors. He is not chairman of the board, though his personal influence is very considerable and should not be discounted. Now, the frequent mention of CIA involvement in the world conspiracy is not by happenstance. My own investigation and the investigation of many, many other people who have greater access to information reveals that the men who run the networks of the secret brotherhood have for decades controlled the America's Central Intelligence Agency as well as the spy agencies of Great Britain and other countries. So it is not coincidental that George Bush of the Skull and Bones class of 1947 was magically chosen in the late 1970s to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Nor was it mere circumstance and coincidence that William Casey, Reagan's appointee to be the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, belonged to yet another brotherhood-linked secret society called the Knights of Malta. Lady Queensborough, in her highly acclaimed 2-volume work called Occult Theocracy, had this to say about the Illuminati takeover of international spy organizations. Quote, "Ancient and accepted Scottish rites, that's Freemasonry, runs its own secret service, which cooperates with the national secret services of all countries, thus serving the aims and purposes of internationalism." End of quote. First Vice President George Bush, then later President of the United States, let the thousands of individuals assembled as delegates know, and the tens of millions of others who were watching television, that he had a destiny to fulfill, which he described as a mission in order for him to perform. In fact, his speech was peppered 10 times with the word mission. The secret brotherhood believes its great work, the illumination of mankind, is a glorious mission in which they are to achieve. Is this what George Bush had in mind when he made the following remark? I quote, "I am a man who sees life in terms of missions, defined and missions completed. The most important work of my life is to complete the mission we started in 1980. That's when he was vice president to President Reagan. I'll continue his quote. "Let me tell you more about the mission. A nation's leader must be able to define and lead a mission." End of quote. President George Bush followed his father, Prescott Bush, into the secret Yale University fraternity of Skull and Bones. Only 15 members a year are selected to enter that particular Skull and Bones society. Out of these, some eventually are allowed to know the secrets of the coming world government. President Bush resigned a 2-year stint on the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1978-1979 so that he could run for the vice presidency of the United States. The inner core of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission are working for world government. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded in part by Marxist Colonel Edward Mandell House. David Rockefeller of International Banking was chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations and also founded the Trilateral Commission and became its chairman of the board. And President Bush were members of all of these organizations. President Bush wants to establish a new world order by the year 2000. He believes that they are destined to usher in this new era of peace and prosperity for the whole world, hopefully by the year 2000. Notice the text of his speech to the nation on January 16, 1991, as it was reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch of January 17, 1991. Quote, "Our objective is clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. Iraq will eventually comply with all United Nations resolutions And then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf. I, George Bush, had hoped that when the United States Congress, in historic debate, took its resolute action, Saddam would realize that he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accordance with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations. Leave Kuwait or be driven out. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. This is an historic moment. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping rule to fulfill the promise and vision of the United Nations founders. George Bush sounds just like the book of Revelation in chapter 13, verse 4, where he said, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And if he's in reference to the United Nations, that's exactly what that sounds like to me. Does President Bush know the plans to have world government by the year 2000? In his speech to the United Nations on October 1st, 1990, he said, quote, "We must join together in a new compact to bring the United Nations into the 21st century. The calendar offers up a convenient milestone, a signpost by which to measure our progress as a community of nations. The year 2000 marks a turning point, beginning the turn of the millennium. The United Nations can help bring about a new day to press forward to cap an historic movement," and of course he means of world socialism, "toward a new world order." End of quote. That was found in the New York Times, October 2nd, 1990, page A6. He knows our money shows the same hope. Quote from the Parade magazine of July 2nd, 1989, page 5, that the desire for freedom from tyranny inspired the world and still does. He said, "Look on the back of any dollar bill, and you'll see it. The Great Seal of the United States bears the motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages." On March 6, 1989, a radio station aired part of a speech that Bush delivered. He said, and I quote, "What are we doing to prepare ourselves for the new world coming just 11 short years from now?" Remember, that was 1989. You add 11, that puts it at the year 2000. No wonder, he said, they had to make war with Iraq to establish the United Nations as the world authority to bring us into the 21st century. Now we have as President of the United States a man by the name of Mr. Bill Clinton from the state of Arkansas. Before I'm through, we're going to show some of the things that are in his background as governor, as a young person when he claims to be a Rhodes Scholar, and yet he never graduated as a Rhodes Scholar. Why did he go behind the Iron Curtain while protesting in front of the London Embassy while dodging the draft? Why did he go there? What did he learn? What was he taught? Then on the other hand, why as late as 1987 did Mr. Bill Clinton go to Italy, go into the communist sectors and learn how to implement an economic Marxist program for the United States of America? And it's documented that he did it because of the very prestigious Catholic newspaper El Sabato from Milan, Italy, interviewed him and reported that he was going into the communist sector. He admitted, yes, he was there to learn how to implement a Marxist program for the United States of America. And then even as President of the United States, why is it that he has implemented the programs he has of trying to force homosexuality on the military? Why is it, as President of the United States now, has he unconstitutionally gone around the only way that appropriations of money can ever be brought forth, and that is from Congress? Why has he done this? Let's go into some of the sordid background of Bill Clinton. Notice this Dallas Morning News headline showing that Bill Clinton absolutely unconstitutionally has bypassed Congress in order to send massive economic aid to the country of Mexico to try to uphold its peso. Yet this is totally unconstitutional. Why are presidents doing this? Now let's go yet to another headline. Notice now the front cover of a weekly magazine called The New American. Here's the big headline, The Clinton Scandals. It mentions such things as philandering, financial fraud, mysterious deaths, assortment of extremists, oddballs, and crooks in high places. It's enough to make America hang its head in shame. But what does this mean, the Clinton scandals? Let's go into the background of Bill Clinton from the days when he was a draft dodger and he was actually calling for the overthrow of the government of the United States right on up to the present time, as much time as we have left.
On January 20th, 1993, William Jefferson Clinton became the 42nd President of the United States. At the time, most Americans were not aware of the extent of Clinton's criminal background, nor were they aware of the media blackout, which kept this information from the public. As State Attorney General and later Governor, Bill Clinton in 12 years achieved absolute control over the political, legal, and financial systems of Arkansas. As president, he would attempt to do the same with the nation by bringing members of his inner circle with him to Washington. The hijacking of America was underway, and its impact on future generations would be incalculable.
Bill Clinton was born in Hope and, of course, raised in Hot Springs. They had open bawdy houses over there at the time, and they had open gambling at the time. But Clinton grew up in that atmosphere, that different atmosphere of Hot Springs. If it felt good, you did it. He was selected to go to the national from Arkansas Boys State, to be a delegate to the National Boys State. And while he was there, he was able to meet John Kennedy. And I'm sure that sparked an ambition in this young man. And he apparently has always had an exceptional, keen mind, a keen intellect. And he early, evidently, had tremendous ambitions. He was gifted in so many ways. The truth is, he's one of the most charming men that I've ever met in my life. He has more energy than any 10 people I've ever known. He was able to network himself into running for Attorney General virtually unopposed. And then he was able to take that position and catapult himself into the governor's office 2 years later and started building his foundation.
When you think about Bill Clinton's aversion to the truth, you wonder if this is because of the lackadaisical moral background that he's had in this area. He lied about Rhodes, being a Rhodes Scholar. He never completed that and still said he was a Rhodes Scholar. He went to Moscow and did business with them against the United States government, and he wasn't challenged by the press about that. In Arkansas, while he was governor, he said he balanced the budget 11 times. He never did it once. Also, he said he didn't raise taxes, and he raised taxes 126 times.
He can accommodate any situation that comes up because he's not hemmed in by the truth. I've never felt that Clinton, consciously or unconsciously, was hemmed in with morality.
I first met Bill Clinton in the mid to late 70s. He was an up-and-coming politician. There were a group of us, Jim Guy Tucker, Bill Clinton, Sheffield Nelson, and myself. And we kind of ran around and palled around with each other. It was from that point that I did a lot of projects for Bill from a marketing perspective. In 1988, I went to Bill. I said, I need a job to kind of relax, mellow out. Bill Clinton and Betsy Wright, they suggested that I go to work for a place called the Arkansas Development Finance Authority. And they said my talents could really be used there. It was the best kept secret in Arkansas. The fact that I was brought in by Bill Clinton meant that there was something about me that everybody had to be careful with. After about 2 weeks, I went to Wooten Epps, and I said, Wooten, I think I've got enough background on this that we can start marketing it. Now, what is the criteria for loans? He said, whoever Bill wants to get a loan. To go back, though, to that moment in time, I'd been there about a month, and I realized that I was in the epicenter of what I'd always heard about all my life. What most people have heard about is the machine. I was literally working, sitting in the middle of Bill Clinton's political machine. It was where he made payoffs, where he repaid favors to people for campaign support. I was in an interesting seat, and I knew it. We had a board meeting. In that particular board meeting, I was sitting at the end of the table. James Brannion, who was chairman of the board at that time, was sitting at the head of the table. James Brannion stood up in a public restaurant, and he hollered at the Beverly Enterprises guy, Bobby Stevens, and said, did you get the $50,000 campaign contribution from the client that you're introducing the loan for? He said, not yet. He said, well, then hold up the loan till we get it. I stood up, went up to James, and I said, James, don't yell stuff like that. You don't need to be yelling it in a restaurant. That sounds real bad. He was just burly and arrogant. He said, who cares?
Bill Clinton sold the concept of ADFA to the people of Arkansas as a vehicle for creating jobs and assisting churches and schools. In reality, millions of taxpayer-guaranteed dollars were being channeled to Clinton's election campaigns, to his inner circle of friends, and to his wife Hillary's law firm. This may explain why ADFA had been drafted in such a manner as to keep its decision-making procedures secret.
If you needed $1 million, you had to get your application handled by the Rose Law Firm, pay them $50,000. There were 5 other companies in the state of Arkansas that were actually more qualified in bond structuring and applications, but Rose Law Firm got them all. I started checking around, and I kept asking, well, you know, one thing's bothering me, to the comptroller, Bill Wilson, you know, how do people make payments on these loans? He looked at me and said, they don't. He thought I knew. Well, that blew my mind. And this is about 2 months in, and it was getting tough then. So I started gathering the documents. After everybody left, I would stick around as if I were working on the annual report. That would give me access to all the documents, and I make copies of them all. For about 2 months, I watched accounts accumulate money. At the end of the month, they zero balanced. I didn't understand totally what that meant, but I thought I'd go ahead and steal the records anyway. I did. It was soon after that that I met a man named Bill Duncan. Bill Duncan took the zero balance, and he told me what that meant. He said, you know what that means? I said, oh. He said, they're laundering drug money. There were $100 million a month in cocaine coming in and out of Mena, Arkansas. They had a problem. They were doing so much money in cocaine, $100 million. You create a problem in a little state like Arkansas. How do you clean $100 million a month? ADFA until 1989 never banked in Arkansas. What they would do is they would ship the money down to Florida, a bank in Florida, which later would be connected to BCCI. They would ship money to a bank in Atlanta, Georgia, which, by the way, was later connected to BCCI. They'd ship to Citicorp in New York, which would send the money overseas. And there's an interesting one, a bank in Chicago. That bank, by the way, is partially owned by Dan Rostenkowski. Dan Lassiter would get the bonds. He would become the broker for the bonds. He would transfer money back to ADFA. He never sold a bond. The money then would leave ADFA, go into one of the various banks for the specific bond loan, and they would zero it out. When they zeroed it out, they were giving it back to Lassiter, less their handling fees.
During the Lassiter investigation, we had numerous witnesses for the federal grand jury, had extensive testimony. People that was connected with Lassiter and drug use and everything else. His cocaine use become used as a tool for sexual favors and also for business deals that influence people. And that's when Mr. Lassiter became quite flamboyant with his cocaine use, and then ultimately led to his arrest and conviction.
Dan Lassiter, who was the best friend of Bill Clinton, who went to jail with Roger Clinton for cocaine. And by the way, let me explain something. He didn't sell cocaine. No, they were giving it away. Huge piles of cocaine in his office. Ashtray upon ashtray full at the parties, and they would give it to young girls. That's sick. I mean, they were giving a highly addictive drug to young girls.
One particular one comes to mind is a 14-year-old cheerleader out of North Little Rock. She was a virgin, and ultimately he ended up sent her to a physician of his. The physician put her on birth control pills. He used cocaine in order to ultimately she lost her virginity, and she got addicted to cocaine. And the last I heard of her, when we had her subpoenaed back to the federal grand jury, she was a hooker in Lake Tahoe.
Dan Lassiter contracted to launder the money. Now, in addition to his contract to launder the money and the system that he and Bill Clinton had set up to do it, probably what he did is he took advantage of some of the cocaine. That's why he could give it away. Shoot, you have $100 million a month in cocaine. They wouldn't care if you took a bucket full a day.
After Lassiter was indicted, I started to receive quite a bit of harassment from my own department, the Arkansas State Police. And I knew the reason behind it because the affiliation with the state police and the governor's office with Dan Lassiter and his business associates.
Once he was convicted, he and Roger went to a minimum security prison, a holiday hotel we call them. He spent, I think it was 6 to 8 months, and he got out. Unbeknownst to anybody, Bill Clinton, the day after he got out, granted him a full and complete pardon. So if you think he's tough on crime, think about a man that pardons a man that gives cocaine to kids.
Fear of violence is robbing our children of their future. We must take away that fear and give them hope. We must give Alicia and all our children back their childhood. Working together, we can.
Do something now. Call 1-800-WE-PREVENT.
Your president, the President of the United States, not only was a part of a system that was laundering millions of cocaine dollars, your president signed off on it. He can't deny that he did. You see, because of that, there's one little catch. Every loan that ADFA made, Bill Clinton himself had to sign off on it. More than Bill Clinton, you better identify the people in the loop of the drug running. You better identify the people in the loop for money laundering. And what you'll find there is those people go straight to Washington. Act 1062, if you look at it, it says that ADFA was developed and created to provide low-interest bond loans for churches, schools, colleges. So now look what happened to our legislature. They voted on a bill creating ADFA, thinking that they were getting money to colleges and schools to buy books and so forth. What better way to run thousands of, tens of millions of dollars, launder it, clean it up, and use the cover of a state agency to do it. The first loan made at ADFA was made to Parkometer, a company called Parkometer. Seth Ward was the owner. As I started looking, I found out that the Secretary-Treasurer was Webb Hubbell. Then I found out Webb Hubbell was Seth Ward's son-in-law. Guess who drafted the legislation creating Act 1062, which created the Arkansas Development Finance Authority? Webb Hubbell. Guess who introduced the legislation to our legislators and got it passed through our House? Webb Hubbell. Guess who got the first loan? Webb Hubbell. Imagine this. Guess who did the audit and the evaluation of the application? Rose Law Firm. You guessed it. Who signed it? Webb Hubbell, Hillary Clinton. You see, that's against the law in Arkansas. You can't investigate yourself when the good faith and credit of the state of Arkansas is involved in a bond issue. He broke the law. Good Lord willing, creek don't rise. Mr. Hubbell will be serving some time in the pen for that one.
Ironically, Webb Hubbell, a senior partner at the Rose Law Firm, was chairman of the Conflicts of Interest Committee at Rose. In 1988, he successfully advanced the Ethics in Government Act, which required Arkansas legislators to report governmental conflicts of interest. Incredibly, this law specifically exempted Governor Bill Clinton, his appointees, and his relatives. Clinton's appointment of Hubbell to the U.S. Justice Department exemplified the administration's total disregard for legal ethics. Hubbell's hasty resignation in March 1994 for supposed overbilling of Rose clients was merely a ploy to remove Hubbell from the limelight before extensive criminal charges could be brought against him.
Let me tell you about Parkometer. The first loan was $2.85 million. Never was a penny of that paid back. It was all a scam. They had, let's say, 100 employees when they started. They got $2.85 million. You know how many employees they had after they got that influx of cash? 100. Didn't increase anything. It's not a new building on the property. They didn't even remodel a bathroom. As the newspaper people started inquiring about the Parkometer loans, what they found was that instead of making parking meters, Parkometer was actually building retrofit nose cone compartments that were being shipped to MENA. We find out that the nose cones were actually being used to smuggle dope back into the country. And what is scary, what's so scary, it's the same cast of characters. Webb Hubbell, the Rose Law Firm, are guilty, I say to you, of conspiring to defraud the state of Arkansas, the federal government, and conspired to solicit the sales and the laundering of money for illegal drugs. This is your president. This is his circle of power. These are the people, when he got elected president, he did not pass go. He took them straight to Washington with him. And by all things holy, I think he was planning to set up and do the same thing in Washington.
In 1982, cocaine trafficker Barry Seal set up one of the largest drug smuggling operations in the United States in Mena, Arkansas, under the approving eye of Governor Bill Clinton.
Barry Seal had a bunch of planes and supposedly had pilots. Barry Seal was a drug smuggler. Now, he tried to set it up in his home state of Louisiana, but they wouldn't let him. He had to come to a state that had a sleazy governor hooked on cocaine, and everybody knew it. Yeah, Bill Clinton was hooked on cocaine.
In 1983, I was made aware that Sheriff Hadaway and one of his auxiliary deputies, Terry Capehart, were investigating a smuggling operation going on at the Mena airport. They had an inside source of information.
Mr. Seal, it was our understanding, was the one who had brought the operation into the Mena airport, and that had initiated the beginning of the money laundering and the illegal activity.
He said 1983 was his most profitable cocaine smuggling period ever. Said that the airplanes that he had placed at the Mena airport, there were 4 of them, a couple of Senecas and a couple of Panthers, and 1 or 2 stragglers, here and there, different airplanes. He said they were purchased solely for the purpose of cocaine smuggling.
There was, in my opinion, more than enough evidence to prosecute a number of people for crimes regarding the Barry Seal case at Mena.
I snuck around, crawled through the bushes, thinking that I'd really have to hide to see them unloading the dope. Didn't have to. You could walk right up to the airport and they'd unload it right in front of you. They would unload it. They'd offload it. They didn't care.
A certain degree of money laundering had taken place among these people that were associated with Barry Seal.
What had not been done was to connect the dotted lines to ADFA. Because once you connected the dotted lines to ADFA, you had actually connected the dotted line to Clinton.
In addition to the operations at Mena, small clearings in other parts of the state were used as drop points for money and cocaine.
They had special cargo doors installed in the side without FAA permission so that these doors could be opened in flight. They'd pull in, slide back, and the cocaine could be dropped out of the side in flight.
When you have a public which is aware of an ongoing criminal enterprise, when you have an international cocaine smuggler who is high profile, and a lot of people know that they are operating in a small area. A lot of people knew about the money laundering. It was common gossip on the street because it was so blatant. And they see investigations ongoing for several years. And they keep watching for indictments. They know grand juries are convening. They know that witnesses are supposed to be providing evidence to a grand jury, yet year after year after year, no indictments are returned. People lose confidence in the system.
Clinton had integrated a number of corrupt cops, judges, and politicians into high-level positions to ensure the continued success of the drug smuggling, money laundering operations. All was going well until a fateful night in the fall of 1987.
On August 22nd, 1987, Kevin had spent the night with his friend Don Henry. They left Don's home around 12:30 or 1:45 on the 23rd of August in early morning hours, and the next thing we knew, they had been run over by a train. There seems to be a small airstrip in the area. There have been sightings and reports of small airplanes flying very low with lights off in the area. I believe they saw something they shouldn't have seen. 3 weeks later, their deaths were ruled accidental by the state medical examiner, Fahmy Malek, and we disagreed with that ruling because we thought the evidence pointed to homicide. At that point, we had a lot of questions and no answers, and the facts didn't add up to what he was telling us, so we decided to get a second opinion and met with resistance from all fronts, both with our local law enforcement, with the state crime lab, with everybody that we turned to. We obtained court orders requesting samples of everything that the crime lab had for a second opinion. And Fahmy Malek resisted court orders. He refused to obey them.
Ultimately, it was proven that Don Henry had been stabbed in the back and Kevin Ives' skull had been crushed prior to the placement of their bodies on the railroad tracks. However, Malek stood by his ruling that the boys had simply fallen asleep on the tracks. Malek had been kept in office at the insistence of Governor Clinton for a number of years, despite vigorous public outcry to have him removed. Clinton's mother, Virginia Kelly, an anesthesiologist, had allegedly caused the deaths of 2 patients due to her negligence. She was sued, yet Malek's rulings resulted in her being cleared.
Malek had covered up for Bill Clinton's mother, Virginia Kelly, in some deaths there in Hot Springs. I do know that there were some damages that were settled out of court, and Virginia Kelly was forced into retirement. And it appears that perhaps Bill Clinton was protecting Malek on behalf of his mother.
As long as Malek's rulings pleased the governor's office or state police, they were left to stand, no matter how implausible. Malek's obvious lack of medical knowledge reached a pinnacle when he ruled that James Milam, who had been decapitated, had died of natural causes. Yet Clinton, who had the power to remove Malek from office, insisted he stay.
It didn't seem to matter what Malek did. Clinton protected him. He made excuses such as he's overworked, he's just stressed out, he's underpaid. They gave him a $14,000 raise, which was an insult to my family as well as a lot of others in the state who to this day are struggling with asinine rulings and the deaths of children and other loved ones. I was outraged that protecting a political crony of Clinton's was more important than the fact that 2 young boys had been murdered. And it didn't matter what Malek did. There were allegations of tampering with evidence in murder cases. There were allegations of perjury in different cases. There were allegations of incompetence and anything that I guess you could allege had been alleged against him, but it didn't matter what he did. They protected him.
A number of people approached the police with information about Don and Kevin's murders and consequently were murdered themselves.
Shortly before Keith McCaskill was murdered, he knew that he was fixing to be murdered. He told his family goodbye, he told his friends goodbye. The night of elections in 1988, he took 2 pennies out of his pocket and threw them on the bar there at the Wagon Wheel and said, "If Jim Steed loses this election, my life isn't worth 2 cents." And he was murdered that night. Jeff Rhodes was a young man from Benton who was murdered in 1989. Shortly before his death, he made a phone call to his dad in Texas and told him he needed to get out of Benton, Arkansas, that he felt he knew too much about the boys on the railroad tracks and the death of Keith McCaskill. A couple of weeks later, Jeff was found dead. He'd been shot in the head. They'd attempted to cut off his head and hands and feet, set him on fire in a dump.
A total of 6 people with information about the boys' murders were eventually murdered as well. This woman, former head of the Saline County Drug Task Force, had uncovered evidence of the Arkansas Police Department's participation in the drug smuggling operation and the cover-up of the boys' murders. She was forced into hiding.
There aren't any words in the English language that can describe how it makes you feel as a parent or as a citizen of Arkansas to see what our officials are capable of doing. You know, I think we were just kind of naive, common, ordinary people. Got up and went to work every day and came home and went to bed and assumed that everybody else did the same thing and tried to do what was right. And I think Kevin's death has been the rudest awakening that anybody could ever have to see what really goes on and to see what's important to elected and public officials.
When Fahmy Malek finally became a political liability during the campaign for president, he was forced to resign. But guess what? Bill Clinton created a $74,000 a year job doing nothing just for him.
I would like an answer from Bill Clinton as to why the main conspirators, as far as I'm concerned, in the murder of my son and the cover-up of the murder of my son have been elevated in status by creating cushy jobs for them.
Meanwhile, Welch and Duncan's investigation into the operation at Mena was about to derail.
We'd been so busy investigating, just concentrating, focusing, that it took a while to register that nothing was going to happen.
We could not understand what was happening. Neither Mr. Welch nor I were ever subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury and present massive amounts of evidence of wrongdoing by associates of Barry Seal. No indictments were ever returned against any of the individuals, and I can tell you there was extensive evidence.
There definitely was some suppression of evidence and definitely a cover-up of an investigation, and somebody should be held accountable as to why that happened.
Not one major cocaine bust was ever made in Arkansas out of Mena, Arkansas. Now imagine that, 10 years nearly in its running. Never one truckload ever got caught.
During the 1992 Attorney General's race in Arkansas, a member of Clinton's staff had approached Winston Bryant and had asked him to stay away from the Mena affair or the Mena matter.
I've done quite a bit of investigation into the Mena Barry Seal case myself, and quite frankly, it is a federal problem.
After Winston took office, Bill told me that he was no longer allowed to discuss the Mena Airport investigation from the Attorney General's office.
The Attorney General's office is not like most Attorney General's offices across the country. We do not have the authority to convene a grand jury and initiate criminal prosecution.
I've always thought it was a wonderful thing to be able to serve your country as a federal law enforcement agent. And for 15 years, I did not encounter anything like the corruption which I encountered after the Mena investigations began.
President Clinton's verbal commitment to a war on drugs has been negated by his actions. During his first weeks in office, Clinton revoked random drug testing for White House staff members. He eliminated 121 positions at the Office of National Drug Control. And he appointed Jocelyn Elders as U.S. Surgeon General, despite her well-known desire to legalize drugs.
That's important to know. That out of Mena came certain trails. One of the trails was to the banks down in Florida. One of those trails led to BCCI. And guess who started BCCI, helped form it? Jack Stevens, from Stevens Investment.
Jack is a major stockholder in Worthing Bank. At a crucial period in the campaign, the bank advanced Clinton's candidacy $2.8 million. It happened that that's the identical amount that the Stevens company had made on a concocted transaction that involved student loan funds under Clinton's control less than 2 years before. An identical amount.
That's very important. When Clinton had Laster, he didn't need the Stevenses. All of a sudden, in 1988, while I was at the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, in came the Stevenses. Laster was in jail. The ADFA had never even put its money in a state bank. It always kept its money in banks in Chicago, Georgia, Florida. When the Stevenses come in, they buy Worthen Bank. And guess where ADFA puts all of its money? Worthen Bank. When Bill and Hillary first took over, all they could talk about was how their health care program was going to go after the pharmaceutical companies. Well, lo and behold, stocks for the pharmaceutical companies went down. Who other than Vince Foster, Hillary Clinton, took advantage of it, and they bought stock. All of a sudden, they go to Tulsa to the governor's convention, and guess what they say? They're not going to attack the pharmaceuticals. And guess what happened? The stock goes high. I go to the meeting, I say, guys, come on. Doesn't that look a little weird? That's called, insider trading. And I said, yeah, but she only made $10,000 or $12,000, just a minuscule amount. Think about it. That's what she made. Has anybody gone to the trouble to look in to see how much Stevens Investments made off of that?
One of Hillary's investments, under the direction of Tyson Foods counselor James Blair, netted almost $100,000 on an initial $1,000 investment, a nearly impossible feat using legal methods.
I can't read their minds or speculate, but I had absolutely no reason to believe that I got any favorable treatment.
Coincidentally, Governor Clinton enacted a number of state regulations allowing Tyson Foods to grow into the largest industry in Arkansas.
Don Tyson put in $600,000-$700,000 all told in all of Bill Clinton's campaign. Guess what he got out of it? He got $10 million. Guess from where? The Arkansas Development Finance Authority. And he never paid a dime for it.
I had heard rumors of Don Tyson and his alleged cocaine use and distribution. And I went through the intelligence files and come up with enough that I thought was sufficient amount of evidence to launch an investigation on Mr. Tyson simply out of the Arkansas State Police intelligence files has been accumulated for years.
Don Tyson was in the middle of the cocaine just like Bill Clinton, just like Dan Laster, just like Roger Clinton, and all the others. So you see, all of this incest, and all of this drug running, all of the trafficking of drugs, sending them all over the nation, came out of Little Mena, Arkansas, right under the nose of little Governor Billy Clinton. I went to Bill, and I said, Bill, you've got 2 weeks to tell the truth, or I'm going to tell it. You're breaking the law, and I can't be a part of it. You made a mistake. I'm not one of your buds, or at least I'm not that big a buddy.
When Larry Nichols made his disclosures, made them public, the Clinton spin doctors treated him unmercifully. It shocked those of us who had been kept in the dark through the years in Arkansas politics. The Arkansas news media had done little, if anything, to uncover anything derogatory about Bill Clinton. And for these disclosures to come out of the blue was so shocking that the spin doctors attacked the messenger rather than tried to answer the charges that Nichols had made. And they did such an efficient job that it caused me and others to look with less than favor on Larry Nichols as an individual, because all we knew about him was what they were telling and the press was printing.
One of the neatest things about Bill Clinton is how he handles the media. You see, Bill Clinton's an attorney, and when a witness comes out against his client, what's the first thing an attorney does? He tries to discredit that witness. They accuse me of everything under the sun, day in, day out. Every week, there was some new scandal in the paper that I was involved in. 6, 8 weeks later, they print a retraction. Wasn't me. But to this day, people in Arkansas think that I'm some evil person.
As a result of that, the boy had to pay a high penalty. In his credibility, he had to pay a high penalty in his acceptability. And then when the new evidence came out that supported everything that Larry Nichols had said, he finds himself, I think, probably in the position of knowing that he had been exonerated, but he has not been exonerated in the minds of the people generally, in my view. And he finds himself probably in the position of wondering where he goes now to get his good name back.
A lot of people wonder how Bill Clinton could control a state the size of Arkansas with the absolute authority that he did. It's not hard. You see, after 12 years, after kissing the people that have the money, Bill Clinton controlled the legal system. He controlled the judges. He controlled the attorneys. He controlled the banks.
It's just a small state, a one-party state. What tends to happen in small states like that, I think, is the longer the person remains governor, that I think the greater the abuses are. And I think the abuses were very, very widespread under Bill Clinton.
One thing that's very difficult for people to understand, Bill Clinton doesn't care about money. He cares about power. All he needed ADFA to do was to channel money to the big players financially. I got tickled when the reporters during the campaign came here. They were looking, trying to find out where Bill Clinton profited. He didn't. He profited by putting money into his friends' pockets.
The way they were doing these bond issues and just the whole political atmosphere, quite frankly, was a scandal. But that's the way things had historically been done in Arkansas.
But imagine this. Imagine the power this man has in Washington, D.C. Imagine what he can do to this nation if he gets that circle of power going there, as he did here. Nothing I can do, nothing you can do can stop it. Because he'll have the absolute power, and believe me, he will use it to have you investigated, to have you arrested, to have your company audited. Now, that's what'll happen when his circle of power is complete. When I worked at ADFA, it was not uncommon for Bob Nash to call me up and say, hey, Nichols, the governor needs about $5 grand transferred to his travel account so he can go see his ladies. And we would at ADFA transfer $5,000 to $10,000 for him to go see his girlfriends in either L.A. or New York. He'd use so much travel money to go see women out of his regular travel budget, he would even have to borrow money from ADFA, not to mention the fact that ADFA's budget was not quite as scrutinized as the governor's budget. But he literally used money, ADFA money, the people of Arkansas, taxpayers' money, to conduct liaisons.
During the 1990 Arkansas gubernatorial race, Larry Nichols, in a last-ditch attempt to alert the public, boldly filed a lawsuit against Bill Clinton. As expected, the lawsuit was eventually quashed, sealed, and illegally dismissed by a Clinton-appointed judge. What Nichols didn't expect was a complete media blackout of the facts he presented.
Back in 1990, after all the damage they had done to me, I did something that most people wouldn't do in Arkansas. I sued Bill Clinton. Now, it's very important to note that in that lawsuit, I brought out the names of 5 women. On October the 19th, the only press conference I've ever held in my life was on the Capitol steps of Arkansas. Every news organization in Arkansas, newspaper, TV, radio, were there on the steps. I read the names of the 5 women. I read and talked about ADFA. No one had ever made such a cold, callous statement against Bill Clinton where he named the women. When I got through with the press conference, I went through the center door and I walked off with the camera crews with me, and I walked all the way to the end to the governor's office. And I left the press release right on the governor's secretary's desk. Not one bit of the press release made it into the local TV or the local newspapers, anywhere. It didn't show up anywhere. The reason I tell you that is because in those days he had the circle of power complete in Arkansas.
Eventually, every allegation stemming from Nichols' 1990 lawsuit and press conference would prove valid regarding Clinton's taxpayer-financed sexual liaisons, his drug usage, and his criminal activities relating to ADFA and Whitewater. Gradually, the women who had carried on adulterous affairs with Clinton began to emerge. The first was Gennifer Flowers, who, like all those close to Clinton, was faced with a decision. Either keep quiet and receive a government job, or go public and face character assassination in the press. Betsy Wright, Clinton's former chief of staff, admitted she had been hired to conduct media smear campaigns against anyone planning to tell the truth about the governor's sexual habits. She was prepared to go after at least 26 women who had the potential of destroying Clinton's chance at the presidency.
During the 1992 presidential campaign, I was getting bludgeoned by the media because Gennifer Flowers had come out of my lawsuit. A man called me on the phone on a Monday. His name was Gary Johnson. He was an attorney. He told me that he felt bad because I was being bludgeoned, and he wanted to talk to me about handling my case. Well, I was craving an attorney, any attorney, to help me.
You know, I saw Larry out there doing battle, so to speak, on his own, and I felt like he needed some help.
I met him on a Tuesday. He was a special attorney. I didn't even know it. You see, he lived next door to Gennifer Flowers.
For security purposes, Gary Johnson had installed a video camera near the front door of his Quapaw Tower condominium.
Looking at someone in front of my door, it got a perfect shot of them in front of Gennifer Flowers' condominium. And it wasn't my intention ever to take pictures of Bill Clinton going in to see Gennifer Flowers. I could care less who Bill Clinton goes to see. But it just so happened she lived next door to me, and I mounted the camera there.
Guess what he caught on tape? Bill Clinton walking into Gennifer Flowers' apartment on numerous occasions with a key.
I actually saw him go into her condominium. It wasn't that I was standing there looking out my peephole watching Gennifer Flowers' condominium. It had nothing to do with Bill Clinton. It's just that I got the camera. I had the camera before Gennifer Flowers moved in. And when she moved in, she just happened to have some very interesting house guests.
Go back to 60 Minutes when Bill and Hillary were loving kisses. They stood up and lied, and Bill said that he had never been to her apartment, that he had only called her once from the kitchen and from his office. That's an absolute lie, and these tapes proved it.
The 60 Minutes interview had been designed specifically to save Clinton's campaign, not necessarily to get to the truth.
And they came to us because they were in big trouble in New Hampshire. They were about to lose right there, and they needed some first aid. They needed some bandaging. What they needed was a paramedic. So they came to us, and we did it, and that's what they wanted to do. When I told Tim Russert that I was persona non grata at the White House, he said, "Why?" I said, "The Gennifer Flowers interview." He said, "You got him the nomination." I said, "I know that." As far as I know from the conversations I've had, Bernie Nussbaum knew that, Gergen knows that, Lloyd Cutler certainly knows it because Lloyd had a hand in his coming on there that night. You know, it was strong medicine, the way I edited it. He was a very sick candidate. He needed very strong medicine. And I'm not in the business of doctoring candidates, but he got up out of a sickbed that night and walked to the nomination. And as I said to Mandy, you know, if I'd edited it your way, you know where you'd be today? You'd still be up in New Hampshire looking for the nomination. He became the candidate that night.
When the Gennifer Flowers story broke, that story was 100 times more creditable than the story that literally knocked Gary Hart out of the campaign.